Welcome, nice to see everybody, as always, at our weekly Wednesday night class in the Zera Shimshon. Just to let everyone know, your phones might be blowing up, your Facebook might be blowing up. On a daily basis, I try to limit the amount of messages I send out, although sometimes I get people saying, you send out too much, others say you don't send out enough. I can't make everyone happy, sometimes you can't make anyone happy, but it's fine. You might be noticing on a daily basis I'm sending out, it's quick, it's 4, 5, or 6 minutes. I try to keep it within that window. It is a daily lesson on the daf. Let me spend a moment just to explain you what that means so you can maybe connect to it and listen to it. We all, almost everybody, spends time in the car. So spending time in the car is great time to listen to the radio, listen to some music, but you could also make phone calls, and you can also listen. What? Get the shopping list from the wife, okay? Or you could also utilize that time as Torah learning time. I know people that they have half-hour commutes, full-hour commutes, and they're literally listening to Torah classes the whole way. I try to do most of it at the time. When I'm in the car, I'm always doing something besides for driving. You're either listening to a Torah class or you're on the phone. So this is a quick way to commit to a daily learning with only 5 minutes. Most of us are in the car for more than that time. But if you're in the car for at least 5 minutes, just turn it on and you'll listen to it. So what are we exactly covering in that short class? So this past Sunday, the Jewish worldwide, how would we say, population, let's put it that way, restarted the study of a one-page daily of the Talmud. This is a cycle that has been reoccurring, and now we have started the 14th cycle. There was a great rabbi, Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who years ago said, you know what? Our Talmud has a total of 2,711 pages. That's 1 page back and forth, okay? That's a lot. How are most people ever going to learn that in their lifetime? So he said, let's make a calculation. 2,711 divided by 365, no calculator back then, equals around 7.5 years. So every 7.5 years, and this happened a full 13 times, we've now just started the 14th time, gives opportunity for anybody to study the Talmud on a daily basis, finishing it in its entirety after 7.5 years. I'll be honest, most people do not have the hour or so to do that every day. So what I'm introducing is something that is palatable. It's something that anyone and everyone can commit to. That is not learning the entire page every day, but what about a line or a portion from that page and then make that a practical lesson to us on a daily basis. This is great for people who learn the daf. Daf in Hebrew means page. It's great for people who learn the daf daily because then after learning it, they get to think or contemplate about something specifically. And those who cannot learn or don't have the time or it's above their pay grade, if you want to call it, or however you want to put it, then you can still listen and still be part of this Jewish worldwide movement of what's called Daf Yomi. That's the daily page. So that's just to explain on what you might be getting on a daily basis from me. Any questions about it? After the class, you can either call me, text me, speak to me, and I'd be more than happy to help you. Okay, we are learning an amazing Torah portion, as it always is, but this week happens to be special being that it is the very last Torah portion of the first book in our Torah, the book of Genesis. The Torah portion is called Veyechi. Veyechi translated as, well, it's Veyechi Yaakov, and Jacob lived. So in this week's Torah portion, not only in the previous Torah portions we had Abraham who passed away, we had Isaac who passed away, and now the final of the trilogy of our patriarchs, it is now Jacob's turn to pass away. Jacob passes away earlier than the rest of his predecessors, than his grandfather and his father. We spoke about why on other occasions. However, off the bat, our Torah commentaries examine, and anybody who would do so and open up a Torah scroll, or maybe look at a Torah scroll this Shabbat, will realize something that is unique to this week's Torah portion, that there is no other Torah portion that has this. Let me first welcome the crowd. Does anyone know how many Torah portions there are in our Torah? 54. There you go. We have a bunch of scholars in the room. Very good. So there's how many weeks in the year? There's 52 weeks. Add 2 for good luck. Don't ask me why. 54 Torah portions in our Torah. In the entire Torah, every single Torah portion starts either at the beginning of a paragraph or an indented paragraph. Take a wild guess. Which Torah portion does not have that? This week's Torah portion. Okay? Now you can't say it's a rule like, okay, it's the last portion in the book, so that's why. But the other 4 books does not have that rule. So we can deduce that may not be a reoccurring rule. So comes our commentaries. We're going to address Rashi's answer. Why is it that this week's Torah portion seems like there is absolutely no space, no indent, no new paragraph? It's rather a continuation from the end of last week's Torah portion. It's a good question? Yeah? Listen to how Rashi explains this phenomenon. He gives us 2 answers. I'm going to first address his second, and then I'm going to address his first, as the Zera Shimshon does as well. So Rashi's second answer is that at the end of this week's Torah portion, we read about Jacob at his deathbed blessing his children. And right before he's about to bless them, the Talmud teaches us, our commentaries teach us, that he wanted to actually tell them when the time of Mashiach, when the Messiah was going to come. He knew the exact day and date and time and location and anything you wanted. He was about to give them all the details. Guess what happened when he wanted to reveal this to his children? He forgot. He knew it, and at the time he wanted to say it, God, as Rashi explains, God removed his Shekhinah, his presence from him, in order that he would not be able to transfer and communicate that information to his children. And because of that, because it was kind of like closed, it was closed to Jacob's mind and closed to him articulating that time, for that reason, the Torah portion is considered closed. The Hebrew word that Rashi uses it's a parasha stuma. Stuma means shut, closed. Because you can't really see the difference of is it a new Torah portion or not. It's right in the middle of a paragraph. Okay? We're not going to address that. We have other fish to fry tonight, other things to pay attention to. Let's look at Rashi's first interpretation, and this is what we will pay attention to. Rashi says that when Jacob passes away, the eyes and the hearts of the Jewish people were shut. What does that mean? So our commentaries explain Rashi at the beginning of the book of Leviticus, so on the very first verse of Leviticus, explains that whenever there is a space in the Torah, we may have all seen it. Not only are there spaces in the Torah at the beginning of a topic or maybe of a paragraph, but sometimes in the middle of the paragraphs there's spaces. Has anyone ever paid attention to that? Yes? There is, if you look at the Torah scroll, by the way, our scroll did a pretty good job at it. It did, I think, at certain times also leave some extra spaces. No, they didn't. There are other Chumashim that did leave similar spaces to the way it looks like in the Torah scroll. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One reason that Rashi says is anytime there's a space, there's an indent, or like if we'd be looking at a computer keyboard, tab, right, gives you an extra space. Whenever there's a tab or an indent, Rashi tells us it's there for us to stop and contemplate, to stop and think about what was just read and what you're about to read. It's like a stop sign. Based on this, the commentaries explain Rashi to say as follows. You know what it means that there was absolutely no space, no time between the previous Torah portion and this week's Torah portion? It's because everything happened too quickly. There was no time for the Jewish people to stop and process the passing of Jacob. In the meantime, literally overnight, the Egyptians took rule over them, and the Egyptians started bossing them around, which eventually led to their bondage and their torture and their slavery. This is why, and this is what Rashi means, that the eyes and the hearts of the Jewish people were shut. They were taken by surprise. They were chanced upon. They didn't even have any time to realize that, okay, Jacob passed, and now we're getting taken over by the Egyptian people. And we will address that. the Zera Shimshon asks, 1 second. The beginning of this week's Torah portion tells us, when I tell you, and someone lived for a certain amount of years, what does that mean? That he died, right? Veyechi Yaakov, it's in the past, and Jacob lived. How long did he live? He lived, it says here that he lived 17 years in the land of Israel. We know that Jacob entered the land of Israel when he was 130. He lived his last 17 years with his son Joseph. Ironic. He lived the first 17 years of Joseph's life with him, and the last 17 years of his own life with Joseph. Okay? The numerical value of 17 gives us the word, somebody? Tov. Okay? So, Pa'amayim ki tov. Okay, this is my own interpretation. Jacob had the beginning of Joseph's life with his most favorite, his greatest son, and the end of his good life, you want to call it, with the 17 years with his son Joseph. The Torah tells us that he lived for 17 years in the land of Egypt. He passes away at 147. Is he still alive? No. Why then the Zera Shimshon says that the Torah, this Torah portion, speak more about speak more about Jacob? It seems like he didn't die. So it tells us he died in the beginning, and then it tells us so much more about him. Let's see what it says about him. If anyone has a Chumash, and you would open up to chapter 47, verse 29. That's the second verse in this week's Torah portion. It'll be found on page 268 if you have a Chumash. There are some Chumashim over here if you need one. Page 268, it says as follows. Vaikruvu. So the first verse is, that's it. He lived 17 more years in Egypt. Then it says, Vaikruvu yemei Yisrael lamut. And now the days of Israel are coming to pass, meaning Jacob is coming to die. What does he do? Vaikra livnot leYosef. He calls out to his son Joseph. Vayomer lo. He tells him, Imna matzati chen beinecha. If I found favor in your eyes, simna yadecha tachat yirchi, v'asita imadi chesed ve'emet al natik bereni b'mitzrayim. He tells him, please take a vow with me. Do not bury me in the land of Egypt. Rather bury me in my forefathers' land, in the holy land of Israel. So you told me he's dying. And then you're telling me he's asking his son. He doesn't even pass away then. It happens later on. Go to chapter 48, verse 1. It's on the same page. It says, Vayhi acharei hadevarim ha'ele. And behold, after these occurrences, the Midrash says, anytime it says, Vayhi acharei hadevarim ha'ele, it means time passed. A long time has passed. Not a day, not a week, not a month. So a lot of time has passed, and then he gets sick. And then he calls his grandchildren and his children to bless them. So all of this to explain the Zera Shimshon's question of, if the Torah is telling us that Jacob passes away, why are you telling me he's passing away a good amount of time before he actually passes away? The Zera Shimshon says it seems like this verse is out of place. Don't tell me that grandpa passed away at 147 and then go on to tell me a bunch of stories, and then later on his eulogy, his funeral, they mummified him. What's going on? When did he pass away? The Zera Shimshon gives two different approaches. And listen to the following. I'm going to give you a prelude about to what I'm going to say right now. First approach, second approach, and then a fantastic idea and rather observation that is specific to Jacob's passing. So listen to how the Zera Shimshon does it. At first, he gives an answer as follows. He says, really, this verse is out of place. The first verse in our Torah portion is out of place because Jacob didn't die then. He died months, if not years after that. So what's this coming to tell us? It's coming to be a proof to the Talmud in the book of Ta'anit. Ta'anit, page 5b, says that even though the Torah tells us Jacob passed away, really, he didn't die. Meaning, he physically died, but he spiritually didn't. Well, it kind of sounds like that from the first verse. It says, Veyechi Yaakov. Jacob lived. Normally you'll say, and Jacob died. So the Talmud learns from this that Jacob, although physically he passed away at 147, he really, spiritually, was alive forevermore. Okay. Then he says, how does that make any sense? Jacob did die. So he says, something very specific and special about Jacob is that even though Jacob physically passed away, he made sure to be with his children, his grandchildren, his descendants forevermore. So what makes him different than any other of our patriarchs? Do we see this by Abraham? Answer is no. Do we see that Isaac passed away? Yes, Abraham and Isaac passed away. Jacob is the only one who doesn't pass away. What's the difference? Is it that Abraham and Isaac are not with us the same way Jacob is? So the Maharsha, which is a commentary on the Talmud, he asks this question and he says as follows. He says, if you pay attention to Jacob, Jacob was the only one of our patriarchs who had all righteous children. Look at Abraham. He had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. One was rotten, one was wicked, and one was amazing. One was righteous. Look at Isaac. He had two children. He had Esav, rotten, not a good man, evil, Rasha. And then you had Jacob, a good boy, righteous, following in his father's path. Now Jacob, so that would make our Abraham and Isaac 1-for-2. That's not a really good average, right? Jacob is not only at a perfect score, but he's 12-for-12. And this is what allowed Jacob to be attached with his children and his grandchildren even after passing. Because he was shalem. He was in shlemut. He was complete and in good rapport with all of his perfect children almost his whole life. His whole life, we could call it. His children were righteous their whole lives. Yeah, they had their disagreements, but it was all based on a halachic dissertation that they either deemed Joseph righteous and worthy or not. But they were all righteous children. Because of this, the Maharsha explains, Jacob was connected to his descendants even after he passed, to the point where he spiritually stayed in and stays in this world, on this earth, blessing and being a guardian on top of all of us. Why? Because he was complete with all of his raised perfect children. That's a beautiful concept, okay? And this is how the Zera Shimshon answers the question, his first answer. So the question was, what is this verse doing at the beginning? It's out of place. Answer is, it is out of place. It's coming out of place to teach us that Jacob never passed away. That the same way, the Zera Shimshon says, the same way Jacob didn't pass. At this verse, and we tell a lot more about Jacob and he's really alive, when at the end of the portion, when it tells us that Jacob does pass away, he didn't even die then. The same way he didn't die here, he didn't die later on. That's the first answer. Okay? Second answer. Second answer is a little different. He says that the reason why there's no indent, there's no paragraph, there's no tab at the beginning of this week's Torah portion is namely to tell us that the beginning of this week's Torah portion is directly connected to what it just said. Right? That would make a lot of sense. So let's turn a page back. Let's see what the last verse in last week's Torah portion tells us. It says as follows, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen. So Jacob, along with his whole family, immigrates to Egypt, and they sit and they live, they dwell in the land of Egypt, specifically in the city, in the region of Goshen, as Joseph set out, that they would be segregated from the rest of them in order they would not assimilate. Very good. Vayeachazu ba vayifru vayirbu me'od. I'll read the translation. And they acquired property in it, and they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. So three things happened. Number one, they acquired property. Number two, they were fruitful. Number three, they multiplied. You could count that as two things or three things, however you want to divide it. That, the Zera Shimshon says, is directly connected to this week's Torah portion. What happens in this week's Torah portion? Well, Jacob passes away. As soon as Jacob passes away, the eyes and hearts of the Jewish people are dimmed because they are now becoming oppressed and taken over by the Egyptians. Listen to the Zera Shimshon's answer why there's no indent, there's no paragraph, there's no tab. It's because the reason why the Egyptians started taking the Jews over and oppressing them and putting all these laws in place against them, the trigger to that was the fact that they were acquiring property and that they were being fruitful and multiplying. They are directly connected. We'll speak about that in a moment. Okay, so the first answer why there's no indent, we said, is because it's really not out of place. Jacob never died. The second answer we just gave is because it's directly connected to the happenings of last week's Torah portion. Now listen to an observation that Zera Shimshon makes. I never paid attention to this. Listen to this. The Torah doesn't tell us that the children of Jacob cry for his passing. Now you might say, okay, so what? It gets a little worse. It actually tells us that the Egyptians cried over the passing of Jacob. Let me quote you the verses and then we'll pay attention to it. Go to chapter 50. Chapter 50 can be verse 1. Go to chapter 50, that can be found on page 284. Vayipol Yosef al Pnei Aviv. So Jacob now physically passes away. Joseph is right there in the room with him and he falls on his father's face and what does he do? Vayevk alav vayishak lo. So Joseph cries and he kisses his father. Fair? Now, go to verse 3. Vayimleu lo 40 yom ki chen yimleu yemei achad nutim. So 40 days went on that the Egyptians mummified Jacob's body, as they did for all royal people. All the pharaohs, all the royalty, all the viceroys, they mummified them. Okay? With different fragrances and all their narishkeit, for a lack of a better term. Okay? Vayivku oto Mitzrayim 70 yom. And the Egyptians cried over Jacob's passing 70 days. One more point before the Zera Shimshon makes his point. Go to verse 11, chapter 50, verse 11. It says, Vayar Yoshev haaretz haknaani et ha'evel begoren ha'atad. It says over here that the inhabitants of the land of Canaan see the tremendous amount of mourning that Egypt has. The Zera Shimshon's making a point. He's saying the only person that cried for Jacob's passing was Joseph, and only that very moment he passed away. If not, the Torah should have specified that the Jews cried or the Jews mourned him. It seems like the Jewish people did not. His own children, besides for Joseph, and that only once, and all of his other children and grandchildren, none of them cried over his passing. That's the observation that Zera Shimshon makes, and he proves it by saying that the Egyptians cried for 70 days, and the Egyptians were mourning his passing. So before we give the Zera Shimshon's answer, let's just think to ourselves, why would the Egyptian people cry or mourn over the passing of Jacob? Was he related to them? No. So, let's take ourselves 2 Torah portions back. Okay? Paro has a dream, and his dream was interpreted, none other than by Joseph. What was that interpretation? Can someone help me? Anybody? 7 years of plenty, and how many of famine? 7. Okay, now let's look at the chronology of events over here. The plenty took place for how many years? Take a wild guess. 7. How many years of famine were there? Very good, only 2. What happened? Maybe Joseph's prophecy did not come so, or his interpretation didn't come so. Look how the Egyptians looked at it. To their credit, the day Jacob immigrated into the land of Egypt, the famine was reversed, and all of the produce, all of the lands went back to being full of produce and bounty, full of blessing. They viewed Jacob, maybe I'm taking this a little too far, but they viewed him as a god almost. They viewed him as a very important individual. They literally were mourning after the fact that he passed away because they got scared. Maybe we're going to now go back to a stage of famine. Maybe we'll be cursed. Maybe we'll die of hunger. So with that understanding, how is it possible that Jacob's children and grandchildren didn't cry when he passed away? And even though we're going to have to give Joseph some merit because he cried at the moment, the Torah tells us, But he didn't cry after that. How could that be? God forbid, no one should go through this, but some of us had went through this, and some of us will go through this as a part of circle of life. When a person loses a parent, they cry. It hurts. More than just that moment. How could Joseph not continue crying? How could the other brothers? They were all alive still, all the grandchildren. What happened? It's a fair question. It's a fair observation. Listen to this. The Zera Shimshon says that when a righteous person passes away, their descendants and even the Jewish people as a whole, if a very holy man, very holy woman, a tzaddik or a tzaddiket pass away, while crying over the loss of that person, the tears and the crying that come through that have the power to offset any bad decrees, to postpone and even abolish, do away with any bad, harsh decree on the Jewish people. So, what would make sense? What would make sense to us is that if Jacob passes away, the Jewish people should really be crying their eyes and their hearts out that this exile does not endure, that this exile does not become very sour and bitter and hard for them. Comes the Zera Shimshon and says, you want to know what? The Jewish people really wanted to cry. They wanted to cry so badly. But you know what? They couldn't. How do we know this? Because there is no indent, there's no new paragraph at this week's Torah portion. How not? Rashi told us. What happened? The same way as this is a closed parasha, it's a closed new paragraph, new portion, so too God closed the hearts and the eyes of the Jewish people. God, according to the Zera Shimshon, did not allow the Jewish people to cry over the passing of their patriarch, over the passing of Jacob. He withheld them from arousing emotions and arousing tears in order that they do not offset the exile that they're in. This is the observation the Zera Shimshon makes. Now put that thought on hold, because the next aspect we're going to pay attention to is going to answer why. Because why would God ever postpone it? I'll just tell you shortly, just in case you forget within the next couple minutes. But God had a very specific calculation to why the exile of Egypt had to take place. So he didn't want to allow their emotions and their tears over crying over the passing of Jacob interfere with that. Okay, hold that thought. I want to just give some practical lessons on what we just said before we move on to the next part of the class. Number one, we said the first answer was that Jacob never died. Jacob was with his children and his grandchildren even after he physically passed away. We gave a reason why. Because he was connected to all of his children, because he raised them all righteously. If we want to live on when we pass on, if we want to be with our children and our grandchildren even after we physically are no longer here, I think we just learned the recipe. The recipe is put all of our efforts into raising children on the right path. It is, after all, the purpose of our very being, the purpose of us being brought into this world. The very first commandment is for us to be fruitful and multiply. Bring children into this world and guide them in the path of Torah and in the path of mitzvot. Based on this evening's interpretation, if we don't want to die, meaning after we physically pass on, if we want to continue living on in this world, in the memory of our children and for the merit and the protection of our children, guess how to do it? Make sure you stay very close with your children and make sure your children are on the right path. Now this is easier said than done. Very easy. You know, I want to propose even Jacob almost lost it at a certain point because all of his children were not in harmony. Jacob passed away in a state of all of his children being harmonious and all of his children being tzaddikim, righteous. Our goal in life should make sure that at our time of passing, hopefully in our old age, that our children should all be on target, on the line of Torah and mitzvot, and also all harmonious. That's the first thing I wanted to bring out. Second thing I wanted to bring out is, as Jews, and this we learned from the fact that last week's Torah portion is connected to this week's Torah portion in that there's no indent. The trigger that the Egyptians started oppressing us was because they saw our success. They saw us acquiring land. They saw us being fruitful and multiplying, having many, many children. As Jews, our key to success is to always be under the radar. We should not be flamboyant. We should not be out in everyone's face, specifically in the face of the nations of the world. As Jews, our greatest success, our greatest blessing is, as the Talmud says, tsamui min ha'ayin, hidden from the eye, under the radar. If we want to have blessing, if we want to have livelihood, if we want to have many children, many grandchildren, good health, stay under the radar. It's kind of hard to, but the more private a person is in their areas of success specifically, the more blessing they have. I'll give you an analogy, or a fact rather, that the Talmud says on this point. The Talmud says, did you ever wonder why is it not noticeable when a woman is pregnant right away? Right? Normally it takes 2, 3, 4 months, depending on till when the belly starts showing. Why is it like that? Because the first trimester of a woman's pregnancy is when the woman, and more importantly the fetus, is most vulnerable. Most miscarriages take place within that first trimester. And for that reason, so no one should place an eye on that woman or on her stomach or on the fetus saying, oh, she's pregnant again, or oh, she's pregnant for the first time, or whatever the case is. It's completely hidden. The Talmud gives one more fact. What is the most populated species on the planet? Can anybody tell me? Close? Ants. Who said? Ants. Fish. Fish are the most populated species on this planet, because within insects there are many different types of species. Okay? Why are fish the most populated species on the globe? The Talmud says, because they are beneath the water. They are out of our sight. There are so much of water life and fish life that we have not even discovered. Why? Because they are, as we say in Hebrew, tsanua. They are dignified. They are hidden. They are away. They're not out and about. Okay? This is something we can learn, which is an ingredient to, Bezrat Hashem, our own success. Third part. We see from the fact that God withheld the Jewish people's emotions and their prayers and their tears, how much power we have with our prayers and our tears. We have to take the opportunity when it comes up, when we are sad, when there is a calamity, when there is a hardship, to hasten that moment in prayer, in tears, because those prayers and those tears have the power to offset any hard decree or harsh decree, whether it could be on our direct family, the city we live in, or the Jewish people worldwide. So we need to take those opportunities and those moments very seriously. Now let's move on to the verbiage the Torah uses on when Jacob beseeches his son Joseph to not bury him in the land of Egypt, rather in the land of Israel. Go back to the beginning of this week's Torah portion. It could be found on page 268. We read this verse. It's verse 29. It says, and the days of Jacob are coming. He's about to pass away. He calls his son Joseph and he tells him, Imna matzati chen be'enecha. He says, please, if I find favor in your eyes, take your hand, put it under my thigh, which was a sign of oath. He tells him, Al na tikbereni b'mitzrayim. Please don't bury me in the land of Egypt. Really? Listen to what the Midrash says on this. This is fascinating, okay? The Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah 96:5, it says as follows. That Jacob tells Joseph at this moment, I'm going to quote it in Hebrew, it says, Bishvilcha yaradti lemitzrayim. For you I came down to Egypt, ubishvilcha amarti amuta hapam. And because of you I said, now that I can die. Which means, as soon as, let's go back to 46:30. Sorry for the jumping around, but I want you to get the proper vernacular of the Torah, it says as follows. Chapter 46, this is in last week's Torah portion, verse 30, it says as follows. Vayomer Israel. So Jacob now reunites with Joseph after 22 years for the first time. And Israel says to Joseph, Amuta hapam. He says, now I can die. After my having seen your face, because you are still alive. So at this point, the Midrash says, when he's begging his son, please don't bury me here, bury me there, he tells him these two messages. He tells him, I came down here for you. So, listen to my request. Please heed to my request. And second, already when I saw you, I already said I was able to die because I saw your face. The Zera Shimshon says, what is Jacob trying to tell his son now? Just ask him the favor. Ask him to the request. Give him a command. Give him a direct command. What are you telling him? I came down here for you, and when I saw you, I could have died then anyways. So now, listen to my request. Secondly, the Zera Shimshon says, why is he giving him two reasons to listen to him? Either we don't need any reason, or give me one reason. Why both reasons of, I came down for you, and furthermore, I could have died when I saw you anyways because my life was complete. I saw that you were still alive. So the Zera Shimshon gives an introduction with 4 seemingly different topics, super quick, so don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to death. Okay, 4 introductions, and with these introductions, he ties, as I like to call it, this. He knits the sweater together with one string, and he answers it all up together in a beautiful way. He's known for doing this. Okay, the first piece of information he tells us. Rashi says the reason why Jacob asked specifically Joseph to bury him back in Israel and not any other of his brothers was because Joseph was capable of doing so. He was a ruler. He was the viceroy. If any of the children would be able to keep such an oath, it would be Joseph. That's fact number 1. Number 2, he quotes the Siftei Cohen. We've spoken about him before. He lived approximately 100 years before the Zera Shimshon, also an Italian Chacham, Kabbalist, author, yada yada yada. He says as follows. The Shach says, as soon as Joseph found out that his father was alive and he revealed himself to his brothers, so that was by the second trip, not the first trip. Already at that moment, Joseph had an obligation of kibud av, of honoring his father, to go back with his brothers to see his father. Right? Joseph had a whole calculation of revealing himself to his brothers at a certain time, and that was the second time. So we'll give him a pass that the whole 22 years being in Egypt, he didn't communicate with his father, was all warranted. It all had a reason. But now that his brothers knew who he was, Joseph should have went with that trip and brought Jacob to Egypt, or visited Jacob in Israel and stayed there with him at the very least. Why didn't he? The Torah says he couldn't because he was a ruler in the land of Egypt. He had a very specific position. He couldn't leave. That's the second piece of information. Third piece of information, the Zera Berech, which is another book the Zera Shimshon quotes. The Zera Berech quotes the Zohar telling us something fascinating, that if Jacob would have been buried in the land of Egypt, the slavery and the bondage of the Jewish people would have never taken place. Hold that. Fourth piece of information is the Midrash that tells us that it was in the merit of Joseph withstanding the temptation of the wife of Potiphar that the Jewish people were able to climb out of the impurities of Egypt. These are the 4 pieces of information. If you didn't remember them, it doesn't matter because now we're going to tie them all together. Okay? Says as follows. Jacob comes to Joseph and tells him, I understand that I had to come down from Israel to Egypt because you were a ruler. Okay? So because you were a ruler, I had to come and immigrate to the land of Egypt. And I swallowed that. I bared that. Fine. But for that very same reason, because you're a ruler, now you owe me one. Now take me back after I pass away and bury me in the land of Israel. Now, what could Joseph say? What could he claim? No, Dad. It's better that you are buried here in the land of Egypt. Why? Because if you're buried in the land of Egypt, there's no exile. There'll be no bondage and slavery for the Jewish people. That would be good for us. Jacob answers him, says, no. it's actually better if I go back and you bury me there. Why? Because there is a benefit to the bondage and the slavery that the Jewish people will endure here in Egypt. And what is that? The Jewish people were only able to acquire the land of Israel after they went through the bondage and the oppression of the Egyptians. Why? Because they could have never appreciated what it means to have a homeland until they knew what it was to be a refugee and an outcast. And the Jewish people could have never become slaves to God, as we are clear that that's what we are. The Torah, during the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, God says, you used to be slaves to the Egyptians, and now I'm taking you as my slaves. I freed you out of that slavery to now acquire you as my slaves. But don't worry, it's better to be a slave to God than a slave to the Egyptians, I can guarantee you. The Jewish people had to be slaves to someone else first in order that they are able to receive the Torah. Jacob, in his infinite wisdom, understood this. He understood that this exile has to happen, and he wanted it to happen fast. That's why when he sees his son, at the first moment, right? Joseph jumps on his father, hugs him, kisses him. Last week's Torah portion, Jacob didn't kiss him back. Why? He was saying Kriyat Shema. Do we remember that? He was doing the proclamation of God, the One Almighty. And then he looks at his son and he says, I can die now. Gee, that's a really warm welcome. 22 years, you thought I was dead, and that's what you don't even greet me. You're doing Shema, Dad, you're so frum, you're so religious, you're praying when you see me after 22 years, and now you see me and you say, okay, I saw your beautiful face, I could die now. Woo! What's he doing that for? Zera Shimshon says, Yaakov was, so to say, in a rush to die, because he knew as long as he was in Egypt, the bondage and the slavery couldn't start. He wanted to die 17 years earlier just so that the slavery would already start. The harsh exile would already start so that his descendants would get out of there already and come back, take the Torah, and go back to the land of Israel. And that is how the Zera Shimshon answers all of those pieces of information. When Yaakov is coming to his I missed one point. When Yaakov is coming to his son and he's telling him, bury me back at home, he's saying, because I came down here for you. I understood that. Now, because of your position, you have the power to bury me back at home. I can't be buried here. The exile has to start. How is it that Jacob wanted the exile to start right away when he saw him? Because he saw his son's face. He was able to see that his son did not sin. He was able to see that his son climbed out of that temptation, which will give the power for his descendants to tap into, climbing out of the temptation and the impurity of Egypt, even within their exile. He was telling his son Joseph, you don't need me to be buried here. You being here, you overcoming that temptation was good enough for our descendants. Amuta hapam, I could pass away as of now. And this is the answer that Zera Shimshon says. How come the Midrash comes and says that Yaakov's giving him reasons? And he's giving him two reasons. It's because they're all interlinked. It's all interlinked to saying, Joseph, you're good. Make sure you don't keep my body here, even though you might think you should. Let me and bury me back home. So 2 lessons I wanted to take out of this. The first is that in life, and this was actually, if anyone listened to my podcast on the Daf Yomi, this was today's lesson that I learned from the page in Talmud of no pain, no gain. If there is no pain, there's no gain. This is a fact in life. If you don't invest, you can't make money. If you don't sweat to build something, you're not going to have finished product. If you don't spend the time, you won't gain or have anything. It's the way God created this world. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells it best, lefum tza'ara agra. Based on a person's suffering and hardship and maybe even efforts will be their reward and their merit. That's the way it is. We see that the efforts and the pain of the bondage and the slavery in Egypt all had a purpose. Its purpose was for the Jewish people to acquire the land of Israel and to be given the greatest divine gift of the Torah. Now listen to the second lesson I want to pull out from this. This is maybe as equal in importance, maybe even more important. This is very practical. Get ready. Whenever I look at a verse in the Torah, I always try to look at, is there an extra word over here? Jeez, there is. Look at this. Vayomer Elohim na matzati chen b'necha. Ve'asita imadi chesed ve'emet. He tells him, I want you to do chesed, loving kindness, and truth with me. Al na tikbereni b'mitzrayim. Please don't bury me in the land of Egypt. 1 second. Do you think Jacob, being 91 years older than his son Joseph, who Joseph unquestionably respected him tremendously, do you think Jacob needs to say, please don't bury me in Egypt? Couldn't he just say, don't bury me in Egypt? The word na over here seems superfluous. Command him. Why can't Jacob command his son, don't bury me in Egypt? Take an oath and don't bury me. Why is he making him take an oath and then he says, please don't? Okay, in the 1950s, this is a little before my time, okay? In the 1950s, cars did not have seat belts. It was around that time that seat belts were introduced. I don't want to say that anyone around here was around in the 1950s or at least driving a car, because I don't want to date anybody. But, as I am told, and as I read about, anyone who got a brand new car in the 1950s was not too enthusiastic about wearing a seatbelt. They were riding horses without seatbelts. They were being driven in the back of wagons and carriages without seatbelts. What are you confining me to this metal box that now drives itself without a horse? However, the drivers often were very enthusiastic about it. And there was a certain driver, I don't remember his name, it's just for the purpose of the story, there's no need to it. Certain driver named Joe bought a car in the early 50s, got into a car accident, got hurt, survived. Soon after, a couple weeks later, he buys a brand new car, and the new car was equipped with seat belts. He's in the car, puts on his seat belt, brand new Chevy, one of these beautiful, big, heavy pieces of metal, okay? They don't make cars nowadays the way they made them back then. And he gets in the driver's seat, puts on his seatbelt, and he goes to pick up his friend, Bob, okay? Joe turns to Bob when he gets in the car and he says, put on the seatbelt. And Bob looks at him and says, no. Joe starts driving and he tells him, put on the seatbelt. Bob says, I don't wear seatbelts. It's a new thing. It's like people who are a little older and they like, oh, that's technology. I don't deal with that. Joe stops the car. He looks at Bob and he tells him, please do me a favor, put on the seatbelt. And without a question, Bob puts on the seatbelt. Does that make any sense? It does. Jacob's teaching us a rule for life. Jacob's teaching us the greatest way to inspire someone to do something rather than commanding them is tell them, do me a favor. Please do me a favor. When we speak to our kids, when we speak to our spouse, when we speak to our coworker, to our employee, our employer, you speak to your neighbor, you speak to your enemy, or you speak to your loved one. If you use the word please, if you tell them, can you do me a favor, you're now appealing to their emotions. And you have multiples of time, more chances of getting it your way. Jacob knew this. That's how Jacob was so successful. He didn't command his child like we all do. Do this, do this, do this. As soon as you tell someone to do something, the defense goes up. Anyone, no matter who it is, especially if it's your children. Especially your spouse. As soon as you say please, as soon as you say do me a favor, that's it. You overcame that boundary. Now I'm going to tell you something. As a joke, I want to say I'm even smarter than Jacob, our patriarch. Okay? Listen to this. Anytime, and I'm saying this sarcastically, anytime anyone calls me up or tells me, Rabbi, can you do me a favor? I never commit. I never agree. I always say, let me hear first. And not because I'm not a nice guy. Most of you who know me, I think I could be classified as a nice guy. Maybe not a great guy, but not a very nice guy, but a nice guy. Okay? I love doing things for people. I love helping. But anytime, now this, I hope not too many people listen to this, because this is like a secret on both ends of the court. Okay, it's like you have home court advantage no matter where you are. Okay, when you're asking, when you're beseeching, use the word please. Use the word do me a favor. But have an alert on when someone is asking that from you, because it's one of two options. Either it's very important to them and then maybe you should do it, or maybe they are trying to use your home court advantage back on you. So the power of the concept of favor and the power of the word of please is very, very important. Now again, I didn't tell you that last part to discourage you from doing favors for people, but it's just an indicator. It's an observation. Whenever someone asks you to do a favor, commit to it. Don't be like me. Be better than me. That's fine. But just know someone is coming to ask you something. Be ready for the ask. Be ready for the question. Good? I'm not getting a lot of smiles. You didn't like that last one. Okay. Let's speak about the last part of this week's Torah portion that Zera Shimshon addresses. This is the very famous crossing of the hands of Jacob. Or like I like to call it, the Macarena. Literally, what's Jacob doing crossing hands? We're not going to speak about that tonight. I think in a previous video that I have online on YouTube, you could find me speaking about that. Today the Zera Shimshon speaks about something else. He tells us that Jacob approaches his grandchildren. His grandchildren are approaching him. Joseph brings them to him. And that is Menashe being the older one and Ephraim being the younger one. Besides for the switching of the hands, he's about to give them this all bountiful blessing, and he stops. I want to quote to you the verse. This is in chapter 48, verse 8. Vayar Yisrael, it's on page 270 if you're following. Vayar Yisrael et bnei Yosef. And now Jacob sees the children of Joseph. Vayomer mi el Joseph. Who are they? Who are they? So you know what the commentary Rashi tells us is he knew who they were. However, he looked at them, he looked deeper into them, into their descendants, and saw wicked people that were coming as their descendants. And he's like, who are they? Do they deserve my blessing? That means I'm blessing evil people. How could I do that? So who are these wicked people? Listen to the following. Yeravam ben Navat, who was the very first king of Judah. There was politics, Jewish politics, as we're not foreign to, unfortunately, that split the kingdom of Israel in two. And there was a king of Judah and the king of Israel. Yeravam ben Navat was the very first king of Judah. Okay? That section. He was a genius of a man. He was a very righteous and pious individual. I mean, being elected as the king of Israel, not only do you need to have political pull, but you have to be somewhat fitting the position. And he was. Yeravam ben Navat, unfortunately, was the worst king the Jewish people ever had. Can you imagine how bad he is? Or how bad he was? That when the Maimonides speaks about the potential of an individual, he gives us two completely opposite dichotomies. He gives us every human being, every Jew has the potential to be as great as Moses. Or any individual has the potential to be as horrible, as rotten, as wicked as Yeravam ben Navat. Can you imagine? Now what that means is that the same way Moses, let's be honest, neither any one of us can ever be as great as Moses. Let's be pretty frank. We are not ever going to be called up to a mountain and being given the Torah. There were a couple other religion innovators who tried to claim that story, and some can argue it went well for them, and others can say it didn't. Anyways, it's not happening. But what we can say, and what the Maimonides, the Rambam teaches us, is that the same way as Moses fulfilled 100% of his potential, each and every one of us could. And that tells us, you know what Yeravam ben Navat was? Besides for being so wicked and so evil, he fulfilled 0% of his potential. He had it all. He could have been the most amazing king Israel ever had. and he threw it all away. You know what happened? The Navi tells us that he erected two golden calves in the land of Israel. And he forced by pain of death all Jews to worship them as idolatry. A king of Israel, can you imagine? This was a descendant of Ephraim. Let's move on. Another descendant of Ephraim was Achav ben Omri. He was the 7th king of Israel. So, again, Yeravam ben Nevat was the first king of Judah, and Achav was the 7th king of Israel. Okay? He was also an amazing individual when he started out, and he also caused masses of the Jewish people to worship idolatry. Okay? One more. The 10th king of Israel, Yehu ben Yehoshaphat, a descendant of Menashe. Not only did he fight and vanquish Achav as an idolatrous king, because he was so pious, later on in his life he turned. And he also forced the Jewish people to worship idol worship, to worship Avodah Zarah. That's serious. These 3 individuals, 2 from Ephraim, 1 from Menashe, were the descendants, and Jacob looks at these 2 boys and he says, yeah, they're great, but what about their descendants? They're so not. How can I bless them? My blessing will add fuel to their cruelty and their evil doings. This is Rashi. I just glorified a very simple Rashi for you, okay? The Zera Shimshon asks a very good question. He says, 1 second. How is it possible that he doesn't recognize these boys? Moments ago, he tells Joseph that I'm going to consider your 2 sons as my own 2 sons. What he did was he took Menashe and Ephraim and he elected them to being tribes, right? We know that the land of Israel was divided into 12, but the Levites did not get their own portion. There was rather a double portion to Joseph, 1 portion to Menashe and 1 to Ephraim. Basically, Jacob loved Joseph so much, he took his own sons and he gave them each their own tribe. Okay? So he knew who they were, the Zera Shimshon says. What does that mean he doesn't know who they were? Wait, it gets worse. You know how Joseph answers Jacob? Let me show you. What verse are we? 9. Vayomer Yosef el Aviv. Joseph tells his father, Banaihem, they're my children, Asher natan li Elokim bazeh, that God gave me with this. With this? With what? Rashi says, he pulls out a document. He shows him the famous, as we all have nowadays, a ketubah, a marriage document. Look, I, Joseph, son of Jacob, is married to Osnat, daughter of Dinah. And here are our children. We are married. Jacob says, okay, very good. Good, bring them to me, let me bless them. The Zera Shimshon's pulling out his hair, he's saying, what type of answer is that? So, do you recognize them or not? Okay, he recognizes them. But no, they don't deserve the blessing because they have horrible children, descendants to come. Okay, they're not children or grandchildren, they were like descendants, a couple generations, okay? Oh, no problem, here's my marriage document. Oh, amen to that, brother. Let's bless them. Does that make any sense? No! Listen to what the Zera Shimshon says. This is absolutely mind-boggling. He quotes a book called the Parashat Derachim. Common? No, not too common. However, the same author of Parashat Derachim also authored a more famous book called the Mishneh Lemelech, which is one of the primary commentaries on Maimonides' book, on Maimonides' famous book of Mishneh Torah. This same author, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Rosenus, and he lived around 370 years ago. He wrote this book interpreting the Rambam's dissertation of Halacha, and he also wrote a book on the Torah, which is called Parashat Derachim. He quotes a concept that he says, and then he gives the answer based on the concept. He says, you want to know the way God operates? He operates in a very chesed, loving-kindness way. He's very forthcoming. Meaning, he will bestow blessing onto somebody, okay, if they're good now, or even if he sees that they'll be good in the future, even if in the interim, he foresees them doing a sin. Okay? So today a person's great, In a year from now, they're going to commit a horrible sin, but a year after that, they're going to be back on track. They'll be great again. God will not withhold blessing from that individual now because of the long-term goal. He's not going to allow that sin that's going to be that God, again, we're not getting to this question. We've spoken about this too many times, how God is out of time and space, so therefore we do have free will, but he could still see the future. Not for now. But God foresees that the person will sin. He does not allow the blessings to come down on him, be blocked because of that upcoming sin. Okay? Based on this, he gives an example. He says, look at the Jewish people. Did the Jewish people leave Egypt as paupers? No. They left very wealthy. They left with wealth from Egypt, and they got a lot more wealth and gold and everything from the splitting of the sea. All of the Egyptians' gold and wealth they took. What was coming right after that? The sin of the golden calf. How is it that God blessed the Jewish people if he knew that they were going to sin with the golden calf? You know how he answers? He says, don't worry, they'll do teshuvah, they'll repent, and they'll receive the Torah. So God looked at the overall goal. Right now, they're crying out to me. In 90 days, it was 90 days later, they're going to worship a golden calf that they created themselves. But don't worry, it's all worth it, because after that they will repent and receive the Torah. So the long-term goal makes sense. He ends off with one more part, saying that this idea of God looking at the long-term goal and not allowing one's transgression or sin that can be in the future be a blockage to blessing is a specific mode of operation that God does to Jews only, not to Gentiles. It's a act of loving kindness. It's a forthcoming that God only prescribes to his chosen people, to the Jews. With this, the Zera Shimshon comes and answers. He says, Jacob was in doubt if he had the status of a Ben Noach or a Jew. Okay? A Ben Noach, which Abraham and Isaac were for sure considered, and so was Noah. They only had 7 commandments. What's the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? It's not that much. It's just very simple. 7 versus 6:13. Okay? Take your pick. Well, if you're born Jewish, you don't really have a choice. Abraham and Isaac were definitely Bnei Noach. Jacob was in doubt. And because of the fact that he was in doubt, the following is now understood. See, the way a Jewish marriage works is it's only bound with a kiddushin and a ketubah. When there is a betrothal, when there's a meeting of minds, when there's a document put in place, that's what constitutes a Jewish marriage. For Gentiles, as long as 2 people are living together, they are considered married, according to Jewish law. Okay? So look at this. Jacob now is looking at Joseph and his kids, and he's in doubt. Do I treat these kids as Jews or not? If I treat them as Jews, so then I'm able to give them a blessing, even though in the future their children are going to be wicked, but they'll have other descendants which won't be. So I should judge them based on now and on the future. Now they're righteous, and in the far future they'll be righteous again. No problem, let me bless them. But if they are not Jews, if they're considered Bnei Noach, Noachides, so then Jacob is saying, I shouldn't bless them, because I see what they're going to turn into. So you know what Joseph says? He pulls out the document. He shows them a ketubah. He shows them a marriage document. Abba, consider us as Jews. You may be in doubt for yourself, but my wife and I have a kosher Jewish marriage. These children are Bnei Yisrael. They're Jewish. Give them the blessing no matter what you see in the future. And that's how Jacob came to being answered by the ketubah to bless Joseph's children. Is that fascinating? So listen to the lesson I wanted to pull out of this. God is very forgiving. God is loving. There's always an open door with God, no matter how far or whatever a person did, to the point where even if a person is going to make tremendous mistakes in the future, God will never hold back his mercy, his love and compassion, and his blessing from now. even though that may lead you and even help us to do things which are wrong and detrimental, God will still always have an open door and always bestow blessing. The second fact that I wanted to focus in on is look how lucky we are to be Jewish. Look how lucky we are to be the chosen people. Some look at it as, I'm forced into it, right, Rabbi? Once you're born Jewish, you can't convert out, right? No. Even a Jew, sorry to break this to you, even a Jew who goes and gets baptized is always a Jew. But you want to know the beautiful thing about that? Is the door is always open. The door is always open in Jewish community if the person's coming back and repenting properly and genuinely. And most importantly, the door is always open with their Maker, with God Almighty. We have to realize how lucky we are that we're Jewish, that God treats us above the letter of the law. He will give us blessing and bounty even if we won't be deserving of it tomorrow, but today He'll give it to us. And this reminds me, and I'll end off with one of the great differences the Talmud tells us between Jews and non-Jews, is that when a Jew has the intention to do something good and they don't end up fulfilling it, you still get the merit for it. And when a Jew has the intention to do something wrong and they don't do it, you're not punished for it, which is above the letter of the law. It's not so by Gentiles. The Talmud says that when a Gentile has the intention to do something right and they didn't do it, they don't get the merit for it. It wasn't done. And on the opposite, if they had the intention to do something wrong and they didn't do it, they are also punished for it. That's the letter of the law, and God treats us above the letter of the law. Now this gift, or this special treatment, does not come easy. And I'll end off with a famous quote. Some call it from Spider-Man, others call it from anywhere else. But with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you next week.